Hey guys, tonight we begin with a gentle drift into a topic that's probably not discussed at dinner tables: medieval sex, or more accurately, what people did behind closed doors when the only lighting option was a flickering candle, and the privacy of one's chamber was more a suggestion than a guarantee. So, dim the lights, fluff your pillows, and let's float slowly into a world where romance, reproduction, and regret all mingled in ways both bizarre and kind of sad. First off, we should probably address the obvious. Medieval people had sex. Surprise. But of course, the reality was a bit more complicated than boy meets girl. Candle flickers, there were social rules, religious edicts, and a fair amount of discomfort, because comfort was not a priority in medieval times. Beds were hard, rooms were cold, and personal hygiene, let's just say, was optional. So if you imagine medieval intimacy as a scene from a romantic painting, think again. It was more like practical and occasionally frantic. Marriage in the Middle Ages was rarely about passion. It was a business arrangement, a political alliance, or a way to consolidate land and power. Royalty and nobility, in particular, approached the act as a duty rather than desire. One queen, for instance, might have spent her entire life married to a man who looked, according to the chroniclers, like a sun-baked herring, and yet she was expected to perform her marital obligations dutifully because dynasties don't propagate themselves. Consent was, as we'd understand it today, often a formality, and this is the polite way of saying it could be awkward, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright unpleasant. But let's not paint a picture that's too grim. Medieval people did enjoy intimacy in their own ways, though expressions of pleasure were heavily constrained by culture and church doctrine. The church had a strong opinion on what counted as proper sex, and frankly, they hated almost everything that was fun. Masturbation? Sinful. Oral activities? Sinful. Position outside of the missionary? Definitely sinful. The medieval moral code was like a relentless, grumpy librarian, constantly shushing you for trying to enjoy yourself. And yes, they had manuals and sermons that read like the world's first anti-porn literature. Interestingly, medieval literature gives us glimpses of how people navigated these restrictions. Courtly love, for instance, was this elaborate dance where knights adored noble ladies from a safe distance, often without any actual physical contact. The act of loving from afar became an entire genre of poetry and song. It was emotionally intense, strangely romantic, and conveniently safe from the prying eyes of priests. But it also meant that for many people, actual sexual intimacy could be rare, awkward, or delegated purely to the reproductive function. Now, let's glide over to the practical side of medieval sex, which, believe it or not, included contraceptives. Yes, people tried to prevent pregnancy, though their methods ranged from charmingly naive to outright bizarre. There were herbal potions, amulets, and even pessaries made of honey, crocodile dung, or other substances we won't try at home. Efficacy? Somewhere between maybe and definitely not. And if someone did become pregnant out of wedlock, scandal, shame, and sometimes public humiliation because medieval society liked to make an example of anyone who stepped out of line. Then there's the royal aspect. Kings, queens, and their courts had their own particular brand of sexual intrigue. Royal mistresses were common, and some monarchs kept multiple women on the side. But because dynasties were everything, these liaisons had to be carefully controlled, or, at least, scandal had to be carefully managed. Bastard children were sometimes acknowledged, sometimes hidden, and sometimes used as pawns in the ever-complicated game of succession. And yes, jealousy, favoritism, and court gossip made even the bedroom a political minefield. Let's not forget the medical side of things, because medieval medicine was imaginative. The understanding of reproduction was limited, often hilariously wrong, and occasionally terrifying. Some doctors believed that women could catch male semen and turn it into disease if handled incorrectly. Others thought the womb had a mind of its own, floating around inside the body and causing hysteria. The origin of the word, actually. Sex could be recommended as a treatment, forbidden as a treatment, or used as a test for literally everything, from infertility to melancholy. Basically, it was confusing, mildly painful, and yet somehow central to life. Humor, naturally, was not absent. Medieval jokes about sex were bawdy, repetitive, and often cruel. Literature, from fabliaux to ballads, is full of sexual gags, usually involving infidelity, trickery, or exaggerated anatomy. There's something oddly comforting about the fact that humans were telling the same tired sex jokes 700 years ago. Some involved clever wordplay, some involved embarrassing accidents in bedchambers, and some involved getting caught in flagrante delicto, always by someone who should not have been watching. The blend of humor, shame, and desire defined much of medieval sexual culture. Now, let's gently drift toward the psychological side. Pleasure was often private, secret, and shrouded in guilt. People were expected to marry, have children, and obey religious law, and anything outside that framework was suspect. Yet, letters, confessions, and diaries, when they survive, show us that desire persisted. People plotted, schemed, and occasionally indulged in forbidden encounters. And even in arranged marriages, affection could grow, though usually accompanied by a generous side of resentment or frustration. Moving on, let's float over to the experience of childbirth and its intersection with intimacy. Women often faced repeated pregnancies, with all the associated physical and emotional strain. Sex could be dangerous or physically challenging, particularly for women who had already endured several births. And yet, the expectation to produce heirs never really relaxed, so duty frequently trumped comfort. It's worth noting that childbirth mortality rates were high, making every pregnancy a slightly perilous undertaking. In that context, sex was less about recreation and more about survival, both of the family line and the species. Lastly, let's touch on the idea of erotic art and objects. Medieval people did have ways of expressing sexuality visually, though it was usually subtle, symbolic, or hidden in plain sight. Gargoyles, tapestries, and carvings sometimes featured sexual imagery, often exaggerated or humorous. Some items were explicitly intended for private use, such as small figurines or manuscripts with erotic illustrations. It's tempting to imagine a bored noble flipping through such a book by candlelight, sighing in relief that not everything was rigidly moral. So, in sum, medieval sex was a mix of duty, desire, awkwardness, and imagination. It was constrained by social rules, church doctrine, and medical misconceptions, yet humans found ways to enjoy, manipulate, and sometimes joke about it. Royalty dealt with dynastic obligations and political intrigue. Commoners navigated social expectations and superstition, and everyone occasionally tried something inventive to avoid pregnancy or scandal. Pleasure existed, but it was always accompanied by caution, ritual, or a side of guilt. And that's just scratching the surface. There's more to explore in terms of scandals, royal intrigues, and the weird, sometimes tragic personal lives of medieval couples. So let's slowly prepare to float deeper into these stories, where bedroom drama meets dynastic pressure, and where human desire meets centuries of strange rules and customs. We'll pick up from here next, drifting into tales of royal indiscretions, awkward liaisons, and the occasional scandal that would make even a modern soap opera blush. But for now, settle in, let your eyelids get heavy, and imagine a world where intimacy was more about duty, invention, and subtle rebellion than anything else. All right, now that we've gently waded into the general landscape of medieval intimacy, let's drift over to some of the more personal stories, particularly those involving royalty, because if there's anything that medieval people did well, it was complicating sex with politics, superstition, and the occasional flair for drama. Take, for instance, the story of King Henry VIII. Yes, he eventually became famous for divorces and decapitating wives, but even before all that, his sexual life was complicated. Henry was expected to secure the Tudor dynasty, which meant producing heirs, preferably male and preferably healthy. And yet, he had preferences that didn't always align with duty. He was called the Handsome in his youth, though portraits suggest more of a slightly rotund, red-faced gentleman. But still, he enjoyed charm, flirtation, and adventure. Of course, his obsession with heirs led to tension, frustration, and occasional marital awkwardness. Multiple wives, chronic disappointment, and the constant pressure to produce a boy made his private life a kind of royal stress test, sleepy yet tragic. And Henry wasn't alone. Royals often navigated a tightrope between desire and duty, and sometimes the results were bizarre. Take, for example, the Habsburgs. Known for their love of inbreeding, their dynastic strategy inadvertently led to some unusual bedroom dynamics. Marrying cousins, nieces, or distant relatives to consolidate power was common, and while genealogy books proudly recorded these unions, the people involved might have quietly suffered from awkward genetics and even more awkward private encounters. Imagine trying to feel romantic towards someone whose family tree already overlaps yours in multiple ways. Charming, right? Now, let's float gently to another royal figure, King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. His reign was famously opulent, his palace at Versailles a display of unimaginable wealth, and his love life, let's say, extremely social. Louis had mistresses, official favorites, and a series of affairs that would make a modern tabloid blush. For him, sex was less about privacy and more about performance, power, and occasionally revenge. Mistresses could gain influence, secure wealth, or act as pawns in larger political games, and yet, behind the grandeur, there were moments of mundane awkwardness, awkward encounters in elaborate rooms, whispered confessions, and the constant tension of needing to appear both virile and polite in public. Medieval bedroom life wasn't just awkward for kings and queens, though. Nobles and commoners faced their own sets of challenges. Privacy was limited. Walls were thin, chambers were often shared, and servants could overhear more than anyone would have liked. This meant that intimate moments often came with an audience, sometimes deliberate, sometimes accidental. Imagine trying to express affection while knowing someone could pop in at any moment. Comfort was, once again, optional, and discretion was a constant concern. Let's gently drift into the psychological landscape of these encounters. Many medieval people, especially women, experienced sex as a mixture of duty, fear, and curiosity. Pain and pleasure were closely intertwined, partly due to the realities of childbirth, partly because medical advice was imaginative at best. Women were often expected to endure, while men were encouraged to assert dominance, all under the watchful eye of church doctrine. Desire existed, certainly, but it was filtered through layers of expectation, superstition, and occasionally guilt. The moral atmosphere created a strange emotional tension. Intimacy could be enjoyable, necessary, and terrifying all at once. Speaking of superstition, medieval sex was also entangled with magical thinking. Certain herbs were thought to increase desire, ward off unwanted pregnancy, or even prevent impotence. Some couples relied on charms, amulets, or recitations of prayers before attempting intimacy. And while some of these measures might have had placebo effects, others were questionable. Crocodile dung, for instance, shows up surprisingly often in medieval contraceptive recipes. Definitely not recommended for modern experimentation. Yet people tried, because when your options are limited and consequences are high, you improvise. Moving along, let's float toward the more socially awkward scenarios. Illegitimate children, forbidden love, and clandestine affairs. These stories abound in royal courts. Bastard children could be acknowledged or hidden, depending on political convenience. Affairs could enhance power or destroy reputations. And because rumors traveled faster than letters, a discreet encounter could quickly become a scandal. The medieval world was one where intimacy and social strategy were inseparable. Everyone knew that a misstep in the bedroom could echo across the kingdom. Sleepy, tragic, and oddly strategic. One particularly sad and subtle example is that of Queen Isabella of France. Married to Edward II of England, she reportedly found herself trapped in a loveless, politically motivated marriage. Edward's attention often favored male companions, leaving Isabella in a state of emotional neglect, and yet her duty remained: produce heirs and maintain the facade of a happy royal household. The quiet suffering, the careful calculation, and the societal constraints shaped much of her private life. It's a reminder that medieval intimacy wasn't always a story of passion. It was often about endurance, compliance, and subtle rebellion. Then, there are the ceremonial and ritualistic aspects of sex in medieval aristocracy. Marriages often involved formal declarations, public acknowledgement of consummation, and sometimes even verification rituals. Yes, there were instances where a marriage's legitimacy depended on proving that sex had actually taken place. Imagine the awkwardness of that conversation, framed as legal necessity. Even in matters of intimacy, bureaucracy could intervene. And of course, humor persisted. Medieval body literature often depicted the sexual misadventures of kings, priests, and peasants alike. Fabliaux, for instance, thrive on exaggeration, mistaken identities, infidelity, and clumsy encounters. The humor is dry, often cruel, and occasionally tragic, but it reflects the human experience. People trying to navigate desire, obligation, and the ever-present risk of embarrassment. Even royalty was not immune to the absurdities of sex. Let's not forget contraception. Again, because the practical side of medieval intimacy is endlessly fascinating. Women experimented with pessaries, potions, and even bizarre talismans. Men had their own improvised methods, often equally ineffective. And yet, reproduction remained relentless. Pregnancy, inheritance, and lineage dictated so much of private life that sex was rarely entirely private or purely recreational. It was practical, politically loaded, and socially observed, often all at once. Finally, let's drift gently to the intersection of illness and intimacy. Medieval Europe was not kind to the human body. Sexually transmitted infections were poorly understood. Childbirth could be fatal, and general hygiene was limited. This meant that intimacy came with real physical risk. Yet, despite these dangers, people persisted. Desire, need, and societal expectation created a strange blend of courage and resignation. Pleasure existed, but always shaded by risk and responsibility. So, as we slowly drift to the end of this part, let's reflect. Medieval sex was not the stuff of romantic fantasies, nor entirely the stuff of horror stories. It was awkward, practical, inventive, and occasionally tragic. Royals navigated dynastic pressures and public scrutiny. Nobles juggled social expectations and superstition, and commoners dealt with privacy issues, superstition, and the ever-present risk of scandal. Pleasure existed in small, fleeting moments, often accompanied by guilt, strategy, or careful secrecy, and the patterns repeat themselves. Duty versus desire, secrecy versus exposure, superstition versus curiosity. It's a gentle reminder that human intimacy has always been a complicated mix of biology, culture, and emotion. Medieval people had their own quirks, inventions, and strategies, all designed to navigate the constraints of their time. Some succeeded, some failed, and most muddled through with a combination of ingenuity, resignation, and humor. Next, in the following part, we'll drift into the stories of particularly strange, or disastrous couples, awkward bedroom mishaps, and the quirky, sometimes tragic personal habits that made medieval intimacy a peculiar and endlessly fascinating part of history. For now, let your mind wander gently among candlelit chambers, awkward encounters, and the persistent hum of human desire navigating centuries of rules. All right, now that we've floated through the general landscape of medieval intimacy and touched on royal obligations, awkward encounters, and social rules, it's time to drift gently into some of the more peculiar and, let's admit it, tragic stories of couples and their private lives. Because if there's one thing medieval royalty did well, it was combine personal desire with political catastrophe, and the results, often awkward, sometimes funny, occasionally sad, but always oddly human. Let's start with King Charles, Fix of France, also known as Charles the Mad. His life was dominated by mental illness, and his sexual experiences were no exception. Charles suffered bouts of delusion that sometimes lasted weeks or months. During these episodes, his bedchamber could be a place of bizarre behavior, wandering around naked, refusing to eat, or commanding his attendants to perform strange tasks. For his queens and consorts, intimacy was often complicated by fear, confusion, and occasionally downright absurd situations. Imagine trying to navigate romance when your husband might suddenly declare you an enemy or vanish into a hallway in a royal robe of paranoia, sleepy, tragic, and mildly ridiculous. Then there's King Edward II of England, whose relationships were complicated, to put it mildly. Edward reportedly had intimate relationships with his male favorites, a fact that caused scandal and political tension. His wife, Isabella of France, had to endure both political and personal complications, which eventually culminated in her leading a rebellion against him. Bedroom politics in Edward's court were less about passion and more about loyalty, scandal, and survival. If you think your romantic life is messy, imagine living in a castle where love could literally threaten your life and dynasty. Let's gently drift to another strange tale, the life of Margaret of Anjou, Queen of Henry VI. Margaret was expected to secure heirs and maintain stability in England, a task complicated by the weak and often distracted Henry VI. Margaret's private life involved managing Henry's moods, ensuring succession, and maintaining her own dignity amidst a court prone to factional warfare. Her personal desires, if they existed, were often subordinated to politics and dynastic pressure. Intimacy, in this context, was less about enjoyment and more about survival, a common theme in medieval royalty. Of course, not all awkwardness stemmed from mental illness or political turbulence. Sometimes it was simply personal quirks. Take the Habsburgs, for instance. Known for their love of intermarriage to preserve bloodlines, their genetic experiments often led to strange physical traits, which, combined with marital duty, made bedroom life peculiar. Charles II of Spain, often called the Bewitched, suffered from severe physical and cognitive disabilities due to generations of inbreeding. For him and his partners, intimacy would have been awkward, painful, and medically complicated. And yet, duty persisted. Heirs had to be produced, regardless of physical limitations or emotional readiness. Now, let's float over to the lighter but still awkward side of medieval sexual life. Personal hygiene. Beds were shared, washing was infrequent, and fleas were a persistent companion. Imagine attempting intimacy under these conditions. Candles flickered in drafty chambers, chamber pots were nearby, and privacy was a generous suggestion, yet humans persisted. Desire, comfort, and survival created a curious mixture of necessity and invention. Some couples found creative ways to navigate these conditions. Others endured them with stoic resignation. Another layer to consider is age. Marriages were often arranged when one or both parties were extremely young, particularly among royalty. Girls could be married off in their early teens, sometimes to men decades older. The combination of youth, inexperience, and obligation could make the first sexual encounters particularly awkward, or even traumatic. Diaries, letters, and court records hint at discomfort, hesitation, and sometimes outright avoidance. Sex was an expectation, but comfort and consent were complicated by the realities of youth and social hierarchy. And then there's the issue of reproductive anxiety. Couples lived under constant pressure to produce heirs. Infertility, or perceived infertility, could lead to stress, blame, and sometimes public humiliation. Wives were often blamed for the inability to conceive, regardless of the actual cause. This created tension in marriages, awkward encounters, and a persistent undercurrent of worry. Pleasure, if it existed, was tempered by duty and fear of failure. Now, let's float over to the social and humorous side of these intimate disasters. Medieval literature, as we mentioned earlier, thrived on exaggeration. Fablio, ballads, and even marginalia in manuscripts often depicted sexual mishaps. Husbands were caught in compromising positions, lovers were tricked, and seductions often went comically wrong. These stories weren't just for entertainment. They reflected real social anxieties about fidelity, performance, and propriety. The humor is gentle, ironic, and sometimes painfully relatable. People have always been awkward in bed. Medieval society just wrote it down more often. Royal mistresses also added layers of complexity. In courts across Europe, kings maintained official mistresses whose influence could rival that of queens. Mistresses could gain power, wealth, and social standing, but they also had to navigate jealousy, rivalry, and constant scrutiny. Sexual relationships were political instruments. Pleasure existed, but it was always framed by ambition and social maneuvering. The line between personal desire and strategy was thin, and missteps could be disastrous. Medical beliefs further complicated intimacy. Medieval doctors had theories about humors, fertility, and sexual health that ranged from vaguely reasonable to outright bizarre. Some believed that certain foods or behaviors could increase virility. Others thought that sexual activity could cure melancholia or hysteria. Advice was often contradictory, leaving couples unsure whether they were doing the right thing, risking illness, or merely following superstition. The psychological burden added an extra layer of awkwardness to an already complicated act. And what about romance? Courtly love, as we mentioned, was an elaborate dance. Knights expressed devotion to ladies they might never touch. Poetry, songs, and gestures replaced physical intimacy. Yet, even in arranged marriages, small acts of affection could emerge. Secret letters, whispered compliments, or stolen glances. Medieval intimacy wasn't all grim duty. Subtle pleasures and fleeting connections existed, often in shadowed corners, away from the judgmental eyes of the court or clergy. Let's drift toward scandalous liaisons, which are often the most human and relatable stories. Royalty and nobles frequently engaged in affairs that were both strategic and passionate. Mistresses, lovers, and secret marriages created complex social webs. Children born out of wedlock could influence succession or social standing. Rumors could destabilize courts, ruin reputations, and occasionally spark rebellion. Sex in medieval courts was a mixture of desire, ambition, and the constant pressure of observation. One final note, before we drift toward a pause: the mundane realities. People sometimes engaged in intimacy while sick, exhausted, or distracted by politics, household crises, or simple boredom. Medieval sex was messy, human, and occasionally absurd. There were awkward positions, clumsy encounters, and logistical challenges no modern romance novel would dare describe. And yet, despite all constraints, humans continued to desire, innovate, and endure. The combination of duty, humor, and perseverance is strangely comforting. So, as we slowly close Part 3, let's reflect on the patterns: awkwardness, obligation, political pressure, superstition, and fleeting pleasure. Royalty, nobles, and commoners alike navigated a landscape shaped by duty, social expectation, and sometimes bizarre personal quirks. Bedrooms could be sites of strategy, discomfort, and subtle rebellion. Literature preserved these stories in ironic, humorous, or tragic form, reminding us that human intimacy has always been complicated. In the next part, we'll drift further into specific dynastic consequences, more unusual bedroom mishaps, and the quirky, sometimes tragic rituals and habits that defined medieval sexual culture. For now, imagine candlelit rooms, whispered negotiations, awkward positions, and the persistence of human desire amid centuries of rules, superstition, and societal expectation. All right, now that we've floated through general awkwardness, royal complications, and some personal quirks, it's time to gently drift into the more unusual marital habits, scandals, and the consequences that intimacy had on dynasties. Because, in the medieval world, the bedroom and the throne were often inseparable. One misstep behind closed doors could ripple through generations. Let's start with the phenomenon of royal obsession over heirs. Producing children, especially male heirs, was the ultimate priority. Queens were often pushed into repeated pregnancies, sometimes with dangerous intervals, because dynastic security mattered more than personal well-being. Some women gave birth almost yearly, enduring extreme physical strain, while husbands might pursue personal pleasures elsewhere. This imbalance created tension, exhaustion, and naturally awkward moments. Imagine trying to enjoy intimacy while knowing every encounter is a test of your reproductive utility. Not exactly romantic. Then there's the curious case of King Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick, often called Stupor Mundi, or Wonder of the World, was known for his fascination with science, law, and interestingly, sexual experimentation. Reports suggest he engaged in unconventional practices, sometimes involving elaborate instructions for sexual encounters. His court chroniclers documented some of these eccentricities, hinting at a mix of curiosity, intellect, and possibly control issues. Even among royals, this kind of meticulous attention to private life was unusual, and let's admit, mildly awkward. Now, let's float toward Queen Joanna of Naples. Joanna's life involved a complicated mixture of political maneuvering, arranged marriage, and personal desire. Her husband, Andrew, was often distant, leaving Joanna to navigate both personal dissatisfaction and dynastic responsibility. Her sexual encounters, when they happened, were framed by tension, societal expectation, and occasional fear. Letters suggest she experienced both longing and frustration, a combination familiar to anyone who has felt trapped in circumstances beyond their control. Medieval intimacy, in this sense, could be a quiet tragedy. The Habsburgs, once again, provide endless examples of dynastic awkwardness. Their marriages between cousins, nieces, and distant relatives created what historians now recognize as high inbreeding. This had physical consequences. Distinctive facial features, disabilities, and other health issues, and social consequences, including awkward sexual encounters. Imagine being expected to produce heirs with someone whose family tree overlaps yours in multiple ways, all under the scrutiny of court observers. Duty, awkwardness, and resignation combined in these royal bedrooms, creating a uniquely medieval form of intimacy. Let's float over to another layer of scandal. Public embarrassment. Medieval nobles often engaged in sexual activities with a constant risk of being discovered. Thin walls, servants, and curious neighbors meant that privacy was limited. Court records and literature are full of anecdotes where lovers were caught, marriages were publicly questioned, and reputations were ruined. These stories, while lightly humorous to us now, caused real distress and occasionally political fallout at the time. Intimacy was rarely just a private act. It was a performance with potentially massive consequences. Religious pressures added another layer of complexity. The church monitored sexual activity, condemning anything that strayed from sanctioned marriage or reproductive purpose. Even married couples faced moral scrutiny. Certain acts, times, or intentions could be considered sinful. This constant moral vigilance created guilt, awkwardness, and sometimes secretive behavior. Pleasure existed, but it was filtered through rules, rituals, and fear of divine judgment. In other words, sex could be enjoyable, but only if one was willing to navigate centuries of moral instruction. Let's gently explore some of the more personal habits that shaped medieval intimacy. Hygiene, again, was limited. Baths were rare, and bed linens were often reused for months. Fleas, lice, and general discomfort were constant companions. Couples had to find ways to manage both desire and the realities of living in environments that modern people would find unpleasant. Creativity and patience were essential, and yet humans persisted, often finding small pleasures amidst the challenges. Now, onto erotic art and literature, which offers another window into private life. Medieval manuscripts, carvings, and marginalia sometimes featured sexual imagery, often humorous or exaggerated. Erotic art could serve multiple purposes: amusement, instruction, or subtle rebellion. Some nobles and royals reportedly kept private collections. These artifacts reveal a curiosity about intimacy, a desire for pleasure, and occasionally a very awkward sense of humor. Sex was not just an act. It could be an intellectual, artistic, or even political pursuit. Let's not forget the consequences of infertility, which were often dire. Queens who could not produce heirs faced intense pressure, shame, and sometimes political marginalization. Some women were accused of witchcraft or other supernatural failings if conception did not occur. Men, meanwhile, were rarely blamed, but social expectations demanded that heirs be produced regardless of personal desire. This created a constant undercurrent of stress in intimate relationships. Sex became less about enjoyment and more about survival, both of the dynasty and one's own position. The stories of royal mistresses also deserve a gentle drift. Mistresses could wield surprising influence, sometimes surpassing queens in power. Their relationships with kings were often a mixture of desire, strategy, and political maneuvering. Mistresses navigated jealousy, ambition, and social scrutiny, all while maintaining the appearance of charm and discretion. Pleasure existed, but always in the shadow of ambition and observation. Relationships were carefully calibrated. Emotional investment was risky, and scandal was a constant threat. Medical theory continued to influence intimate life. The concept of humors dominated medieval thought, and doctors offered advice ranging from plausible to bizarre. Sexual activity was sometimes recommended as a cure, other times forbidden. Foods, herbs, and potions were prescribed to improve performance or fertility. Advice was contradictory, leaving couples to improvise, guess, and occasionally endure discomfort in the pursuit of dynastic success. Finally, let's drift into some of these slightly lighter and more human moments. Even amidst awkwardness, risk, and obligation, medieval people found small ways to enjoy intimacy. Secret glances, whispered compliments, and fleeting acts of affection could exist alongside duty and superstition. The humor, absurdity, and human persistence shine through in literature, art, and surviving records. Despite rules, discomfort, and social pressure, desire endured, occasionally triumphing in subtle, quiet ways. So, as we slowly settle at the end of Part 4, let's reflect. Medieval intimacy was a complex dance of duty, desire, and societal expectation. Royals navigated dynastic pressure, political intrigue, and awkward genetics. Nobles dealt with scandal, superstition, and hygiene challenges. Commoners balanced privacy, social norms, and reproductive obligations. Across classes, pleasure existed, but was framed by constraint, guilt, and occasionally absurdity. In the next part, we'll gently float into the most unusual, tragic, or ironic tales of medieval couples, stories where desire, duty, and disaster collide in fascinating ways. For now, imagine candlelit rooms, whispered negotiations, awkward moments, and the subtle persistence of human longing amid centuries of rules, expectations, and odd habits. All right, now that we've floated through awkward bedrooms, dynastic pressure, and curious marital habits, let's drift gently into some of the most unusual, ironic, or tragically human stories of medieval intimacy. Because if there's one thing the Middle Ages had in abundance, it was couples whose private lives were at once awkward, politically charged, and sometimes deeply sad. Let's start with King Richard II of England. Richard was young, beautiful in his own way, and yet disastrously constrained by political expectations. His marriage was arranged as usual to secure alliances, leaving little room for personal desire. Chroniclers hint that Richard's personal inclinations may have been unconventional, though details are hazy. Regardless, the pressure to consummate, produce heirs, and appear in control created a subtle tension that quietly shaped his reign. Royal intimacy could be a personal burden, and for Richard, it certainly seems to have been that. Now, let's drift to a slightly ironic tale. The marriage of Margaret of Austria to Philibert II of Savoy. Margaret was highly educated, politically astute, and apparently not entirely enthusiastic about her nuptials. Philibert, though charming in certain accounts, had habits and quirks that made private life awkward. Chroniclers describe tension, discomfort, and some mild scandal, not the kind that ends dynasties, but enough to leave everyone feeling slightly uncomfortable. Even in seemingly idealized royal unions, the mundane reality of intimacy introduced human awkwardness, disappointment, and subtle tragedy. The Habsburgs once again deserve attention because their dynastic strategy produced a wealth of awkward and sometimes disastrous couples. Charles II of Spain, often called the Bewitched, suffered from severe physical and cognitive disabilities due to generations of inbreeding. His marriages, intended to consolidate power and preserve lineage, were awkward, tragic, and medically complicated. He was physically weak, often sickly, and yet expected to fulfill marital and dynastic duties. His queens, meanwhile, had to navigate both the physical realities of their partner and the political imperatives of their roles. The results were quietly tragic, filled with awkwardness, duty, and resignation. Let's float gently toward some social customs that shaped intimacy. The medieval world had rituals surrounding marriage, sex, and fertility that now seem peculiar or ironic. Public acknowledgement of consummation was sometimes required. Fertility tests could involve bizarre procedures or symbols, and various charms, potions, and herbal concoctions were recommended to enhance desire or ensure conception. These rituals reveal both human creativity and the ever-present anxiety surrounding reproduction. They are at once humorous, slightly absurd, and deeply revealing about societal priorities. Now, the lighter, more ironic side. Medieval literature is full of sexual mishaps and awkward encounters. Fablio, ballads, and manuscript marginalia depict husbands caught in compromising positions, lovers tricked or outwitted, and situations escalating into mild chaos. These stories serve as both entertainment and moral caution. They reflect real anxieties about fidelity, performance, and propriety. And if you pay attention, you can see the continuity of human experience. Awkwardness, miscommunication, and embarrassment in the bedroom is not new. It has been around for centuries. Let's drift toward specific royal scandals. One of the most infamous involves King Edward IV of England. Edward's numerous affairs, some with married women of court, sparked tension and political unrest. His private life was intertwined with his public role, making each sexual encounter a potential scandal. Mistresses could gain influence, rivalries could erupt, and reputation could be ruined, all while maintaining the delicate appearance of royal decorum. Pleasure existed, certainly, but always in the shadow of power and observation. Medical and religious ideas continued to shape sexual behavior. Humors, fertility, and the moral landscape dictated who could do what, when, and how. Sexual activity could be encouraged, forbidden, or ritualized depending on perceived health, societal norms, or divine favor. Couples had to navigate these rules, often improvising, guessing, or enduring discomfort. Pleasure, as always, was filtered through layers of constraint, superstition, and occasional absurdity. Now, let's float to some truly tragic personal stories. Queen Isabella of France, as mentioned earlier, endured a marriage to Edward II that combined political frustration, emotional neglect, and personal disappointment. Edward's attention to male favorites, court intrigues, and ineffective rulership left Isabella in a state of quiet desperation. Letters and chronicles reveal both longing and frustration, reflecting the emotional strain of a woman navigating duty, desire, and political expectation. Medieval intimacy, in this context, could be profoundly lonely. Royal mistresses, again, deserve attention. Figures such as Diane de Poitiers, mistress of Henry II of France, wielded influence and maintained intimate relationships with kings, balancing desire and ambition. Mistresses had to navigate jealousy, rivalry, and scrutiny, often using charm, intelligence, and strategic behavior to maintain position. Pleasure existed, yes, but always within constraints of social hierarchy, politics, and observation. Intimacy was never purely private. It was performance, strategy, and survival all at once. The mundane realities of medieval life further complicated matters. Hygiene was limited, bedrooms were shared, and comfort was rare. Fleas, lice, cold rooms, and hard beds created persistent physical challenges. Young marriages introduced inexperience and awkwardness. Frequent pregnancies added strain, and social or religious pressure magnified every misstep. Yet, humans persisted, desire endured, creativity emerged, and humor, often ironic or dark, helped people cope. Let's drift toward reproduction, which dominated much of medieval intimacy. Infertility created tension, blame, and sometimes scandal. Fertility was linked to social standing, dynastic security, and personal worth. Couples experimented with remedies, herbs, charms, and advice from physicians whose understanding ranged from reasonable to bizarre. Pressure to produce heirs shaped sexual encounters, often overshadowing pleasure with anxiety and obligation. Yet, within these constraints, people found small moments of intimacy and subtle satisfaction, however fleeting. Finally, let's touch on the symbolic and artistic side. Erotic imagery in manuscripts, carvings, and marginalia reflected fascination with intimacy. Humorous, exaggerated, or ironic depictions offered amusement, guidance, or rebellion. Even in constrained social systems, humans found ways to express curiosity, desire, and creativity. Art became a space where the awkward, tragic, or comical aspects of intimacy were preserved for posterity. So, as we slowly settle at the end of Part 5, let's reflect. Medieval intimacy was complex, layered, and deeply human. Royalty navigated dynastic pressure, awkward genetics, and political scrutiny. Nobles dealt with scandal, superstition, and hygiene challenges. Commoners balanced privacy, social expectation, and reproductive pressure. Across classes, pleasure existed, but always filtered through duty, constraint, and occasionally absurdity. Desire persisted, humor endured, and human ingenuity found ways to navigate centuries of expectation. In the next part, we'll drift further into the most bizarre, ironic, or quietly tragic stories, including unusual sexual customs, dynastic complications, and subtle rebellions. For now, imagine candlelit rooms, whispered negotiations, awkward positions, and the persistence of human desire amid centuries of rules, expectation, and human folly. All right, now that we've gently drifted through awkward encounters, dynastic pressure, scandals, and marital quirks, let's float toward some of the most bizarre and quietly rebellious aspects of medieval intimacy, because, as we've seen, even in a world governed by rules, superstition, and obligation, people found ways to assert themselves, sometimes subtly, sometimes absurdly, and occasionally tragically. One curious phenomenon was the elaborate courtship and pre-marriage ritual. Noble couples often engaged in carefully prescribed dances of flirtation, letters, and symbolic gestures. In some cases, these acts were purely performative, designed to show politeness, obedience, or cleverness. Yet, behind the ritual, private desire sometimes existed, awkwardly poking through the constraints of etiquette. Letters could be coded, gestures misinterpreted, and glances stolen in corridors. The theater of courtly love made intimacy a blend of performance, speculation, and subtle personal assertion. Now, let's float gently toward more unusual sexual customs. Some courts had elaborate rules for what was permissible in the bedroom. Certain days were considered more auspicious for conception. Some clergy advised against particular positions or times. Fertility charms, amulets, and incantations were employed alongside herbal remedies. And while some advice was harmless, other instructions bordered on the absurd, like tying herbs to the bedposts or reciting prayers while performing acts of intimacy. The blending of superstition, science, and desire created an environment in which every encounter carried layers of significance, anxiety, and occasional absurdity. Then there's the ironic case of dynastic misfortune. Royals who successfully navigated political marriages sometimes found themselves undone by private life. Infertility, illness, or awkward behavior could destabilize succession, provoke scandal, or invite rebellion. Consider Joanna of Castile, known as Joanna the Mad. Her marriage to Philip the Handsome initially seemed politically advantageous, but Philip's untimely death, combined with Joanna's emotional instability, created intimate and dynastic complications that reverberated through Spain for decades. Love, duty, and mental health intertwined to produce situations both tragic and awkward. Let's drift to the subtle rebellions of women in constrained circumstances. Queens and noblewomen sometimes used sexuality to assert influence, negotiate power, or secure personal advantage. The manipulation could be gentle, a whispered suggestion, a discreet favor, or more overt, involving alliances and intrigue. These acts were rarely recorded in full, often surviving as hints in letters, chronicles, or court gossip. The quiet rebellion highlights a recurring pattern. Even under strict social and moral rules, people found ways to exert agency, however constrained, in matters of intimacy. Another layer is the ironic contrast between idealized love and actual practice. Courtly love often emphasized devotion to a distant or unattainable beloved, creating a space for fantasy, poetry, and subtle rebellion against marital obligation. Meanwhile, arranged marriages imposed duties, political pressures, and reproductive expectations. The tension between fantasy and reality produced awkward, sometimes tragic, and occasionally comical outcomes. Desire could exist, but it often had to be navigated carefully amid social scrutiny. Medical theories continued to complicate matters. Humoral theory dictated what foods, behaviors, and sexual acts were appropriate for health, fertility, and mood. Advice ranged from reasonable recommendations to bizarre, barely believable prescriptions. Couples often had to improvise, guess, and endure discomfort to comply with both medical and social expectations. Even intimacy, a deeply personal act, was framed by external constraints. Let's float gently to the subject of royal mistresses and the social consequences of extramarital relationships. Mistresses could wield surprising influence over kings, courts, and political events. Their relationships often required strategic thinking, charm, and subtle manipulation. Pleasure existed, certainly, but always with awareness of observation, rumor, and consequence. Mistresses, queens, and other women navigated a complex terrain where desire, ambition, and survival intertwined. It's a quiet reminder that even in constrained circumstances, human agency persisted. Now, consider the everyday awkwardness endured by commoners. Shared beds, thin walls, and limited privacy created ongoing practical challenges. Fleas, lice, and poor hygiene added discomfort. Young marriages introduced inexperience, and frequent pregnancies added strain. Yet, people persisted. Creativity, patience, and small moments of intimacy allowed desire to survive, even under conditions that would strike modern readers as distinctly unpleasant. Humans, it seems, have always been adaptable when it comes to intimacy. Religious pressures continued to loom over all classes. Clergy monitored sexual behavior, condemned non-reproductive acts, and prescribed moral conduct. Even married couples faced scrutiny. Certain positions, intentions, or timings could be deemed sinful. Couples had to navigate guilt, ritual, and advice while attempting pleasure. The moral atmosphere created a tension in which desire was ever present, but frequently constrained, awkward, and self-conscious. Let's drift toward the lighter, more ironic aspects preserved in literature and art. Manuscripts often featured erotic marginalia, humorous depictions of sexual mishaps, and exaggerated accounts of awkward encounters. These images preserved human curiosity, humor, and occasional rebellion. They remind us that even in a world of rules, restrictions, and obligation, humans found ways to explore, question, and occasionally poke fun at the intricacies of intimacy. The combination of all these factors, duty, superstition, politics, and personal quirks, produced an environment where intimacy was rarely simple. Pleasure existed, certainly, but it was filtered through obligation, anxiety, and social expectation. Yet, humans persisted. Humor, subtle rebellion, and fleeting enjoyment endured, showing the persistence of desire amid centuries of constraint. Finally, let's reflect on the broader patterns. Medieval intimacy was a mixture of awkwardness, duty, superstition, scandal, and occasional pleasure. Royals navigated dynastic pressure, awkward genetics, and political scrutiny. Nobles managed scandal, social norms, and hygiene challenges. Commoners balanced privacy, expectation, and reproductive obligations. Across all classes, humans found small ways to assert agency, express desire, and navigate the constraints of their time. So, as we gently close, Part 6, imagine candlelit chambers, whispered negotiations, awkward gestures, subtle rebellion, and the quiet persistence of desire. Intimacy, even under pressure, survived, evolved, and occasionally flourished. The medieval world was complicated, constrained, and often absurd, but human curiosity, creativity, and longing endured. All right, now that we've floated through awkward bedrooms, dynastic pressures, scandals, and subtle rebellions, it's time to gently drift toward the final reflections, the lingering eccentricities, the bizarre customs, and the quiet persistence of human desire in the medieval world. Think of this as the slow exhale after a long, meandering stroll through candlelit corridors, whispering chambers, and occasional awkward mishaps. Let's start with some of the more unusual sexual customs that persisted across Europe. Certain regions had rituals for fertility, often involving symbolic acts, charms, or public acknowledgement. For example, some couples were advised to sleep with particular positions to ensure a male heir. Others used charms, tiny amulets, tucked beneath pillows or tied to bedposts, to encourage conception. And while some of this advice may seem absurd now, it highlights the omnipresent anxiety about reproduction and dynastic stability. Desire was present, certainly, but it was filtered through superstition, ritual, and often very awkward instructions. Now, let's drift gently toward the ironic consequences of dynastic marriages. Royals were expected to produce heirs, often under awkward or medically challenging conditions. Infertility, physical disability, or untimely death could destabilize entire kingdoms. Consider the tragic irony of the Habsburgs once again. Charles II of Spain, physically weak and mentally impaired due to generations of inbreeding, was expected to secure the Spanish succession. His marriages, intended to consolidate power, instead highlighted the absurdity and tragedy of dynastic expectation. Bedrooms became theaters where personal desire, duty, and political necessity collided in quiet, awkward ways. Royal mistresses, as we've mentioned, often played crucial roles in these dynamics. Figures like Diane de Poitiers and Madame de Pompadour, slightly later, but reflective of the tradition, navigated relationships that were simultaneously intimate, political, and socially scrutinized. Their influence depended on charm, subtlety, and sometimes strategic withholding or granting of access. Pleasure existed, yes, but always entangled with social calculation. These women remind us that human intimacy in constrained environments was never just about desire. It was also about agency, survival, and occasionally quiet rebellion. Let's drift toward the domestic realities that shaped everyday intimacy. Shared bedrooms, thin walls, and limited privacy created challenges for couples of all classes. Fleas, lice, and lack of bathing made close contact physically uncomfortable. Young marriages added inexperience, and frequent pregnancies added strain. Yet, within these constraints, humans persisted. Moments of tenderness, fleeting pleasure, and subtle humor endured, demonstrating resilience and adaptability. Even when conditions were far from ideal, intimacy continued, quietly asserting itself amid adversity. Religious influence also shaped private life, sometimes in ironic ways. Clergy monitored sexual conduct, condemned non-reproductive acts, and prescribed moral behavior. Certain acts, intentions, or timings could be deemed sinful, creating tension between desire and obligation. Yet, humans consistently found ways to navigate these rules. Whispered apologies, secretive behaviors, or subtle reinterpretations of doctrine allowed desire to survive under moral scrutiny. It's an ongoing reminder that human creativity persists even in highly constrained environments. Literature and art preserved the humor, irony, and occasional tragedy of medieval intimacy. Erotic marginalia, fabliaux, and ballads depicted sexual mishaps, awkward encounters, and exaggerated stories that entertained and instructed simultaneously. These records remind us that medieval humans were aware of the absurdity, awkwardness, and emotional complexity of sexual life. Desire, embarrassment, and humor were constants across centuries and social classes. Now, let's float toward some final personal stories that gently illustrate broader patterns. Queen Isabella of France endured a marriage filled with political frustration and personal disappointment. Margaret of Austria navigated awkward marital expectations and subtle rebellion through wit and strategic engagement. Charles II of Spain faced tragic physical and cognitive limitations that complicated every intimate encounter. Across these examples, patterns emerge. Intimacy was constrained, duty was ever present, and human desire persisted despite obstacles, awkwardness, and social expectation. Even in the common population, patterns are strikingly similar. Shared living spaces, hygiene challenges, and reproductive obligations created practical obstacles. Desire endured, creativity emerged, and humor helped people navigate awkward or unpleasant circumstances. Medieval intimacy, whether royal or common, was marked by adaptation, subtle rebellion, and occasional triumphs of human connection. Medical and social advice continued to filter private life, often in ironic or absurd ways. Humoral theory, fertility charms, and moral instruction shaped behavior. Advice could be contradictory, forcing couples to improvise, endure discomfort, or rely on intuition. Pleasure existed, certainly, but always within a lattice of expectation, superstition, and practical challenge. This intersection of constraint and desire defines the medieval experience in a uniquely human way. As we drift toward the conclusion, let's reflect on the overarching patterns we've explored. Medieval intimacy was rarely simple or private. Duty, social expectation, superstition, hygiene, and political pressure framed sexual behavior across classes. Yet, within these constraints, human desire persisted. Humor, irony, and subtle rebellion allowed individuals to assert agency, find fleeting pleasure, and navigate complex social landscapes. The awkward, tragic, and occasionally absurd stories remind us that intimacy has always been complicated, shaped by both circumstance and personal agency. Finally, let's consider the broader emotional landscape. Medieval people experienced longing, frustration, humor, fear, and occasional delight. Intimacy could be awkward, tragic, or absurd, yet it remained central to human experience. Royals balanced political necessity and desire. Nobles navigated scandal and social expectation. Commoners endured practical challenges and social norms. Across all levels of society, intimacy persisted as a human constant, revealing resilience, creativity, and adaptability. So, as we gently close, Part 7, imagine the flickering candlelight, whispered negotiations, awkward gestures, subtle rebellion, and enduring desire. The medieval world was constrained, absurd, and sometimes tragic, but humans continued to navigate intimacy with humor, patience, and occasional ingenuity. Desire endured, awkwardness persisted, and the human spirit quietly adapted to centuries of expectation and societal rule. And with that, we drift gently to the end of our exploration. Take a deep breath, settle under your covers, and imagine the candlelit rooms, awkward encounters, and persistent longing that filled medieval lives. The stories are awkward, ironic, sometimes tragic, but ultimately a reflection of the timeless persistence of human desire. And so, as we slowly come to the end of our journey through the awkward, the ironic, and the quietly tragic landscape of medieval intimacy, let's take a moment to just breathe. Dim the lights in your room, sink into your chair or bed, and let the images of candlelit chambers, shared beds, and whispered corridors float gently through your mind. Throughout our exploration, we've seen how intimacy in the Middle Ages was never simple. Royals navigated duty, genetics, and politics while trying somehow to find moments of desire. Nobles balanced scandal, etiquette, and superstition, often with awkward or ironic outcomes. Commoners dealt with privacy challenges, hygiene struggles, and social pressure, yet desire persisted, subtle and quietly resilient. We've drifted through the stories of queens who endured loneliness, kings whose personal quirks complicated dynasties, and couples whose love, or lack thereof, shaped history in ways both tragic and absurd. We've examined fertility charms, moral oversight, and bizarre customs that reveal the strange intersection of pleasure, duty, and expectation. And through it all, humans found ways to laugh, to rebel subtly, and to assert agency, even when the world insisted on constraint. Medieval intimacy, in all its awkwardness, teaches us something timeless, that desire, curiosity, and the quest for connection are constants of the human experience. Across centuries, across classes, and amid every bizarre custom or painful obligation, people sought closeness, comfort, and small pleasures. Humor, patience, and ingenuity endured. Love, longing, and awkwardness were, and still are, part of being human. So as you settle in, imagine the soft flicker of candlelight, the quiet murmur of voices behind thick walls, the subtle gestures and secret glances that filled medieval rooms. Let the absurdity, the tragedy, and the gentle humor of it all lull your mind toward calm reflection. Think of the persistence of human desire, quietly enduring through centuries of expectation, discomfort, and social constraint. And with that, we leave the Middle Ages behind. Take a deep, slow breath. Let your shoulders relax. Picture the past, not as a distant story, but as a reminder of how human connection, awkward, complicated, and often imperfect, has always persisted. Let the whispers, the subtle laughter, and the quiet resilience of medieval intimacy fade gently into the night, carrying you toward rest. Good night.